There was a time, not long ago, when people in Europe and America thought eating the flesh of Egyptian mummies could cure illness, restore youth, and brighten skin. It wasn't a fringe belief. It was mainstream. It spanned centuries. Doctors prescribed it. Artists painted with it. Royalty swallowed it. And the supply chain, that was real too. Tombs were looted. Bodies were harvested. Merchants got rich. Empires looked the other way. This is not a metaphor. This is history. But before you get comfortable, make sure to like and subscribe if you find these stories interesting. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always so fascinating connecting with people from around the world. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, close your eyes, and just listen. Let your mind drift. There's no need to remember anything. This story is here to keep you company as you rest. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment when mummies went from sacred relics to crushed powder in a medicine jar. But to understand the transformation, we need to step back, centuries before the Enlightenment, before the Renaissance, even before Europe rediscovered the classical world. We begin in Egypt, thousands of years ago. The practice of mummification in ancient Egypt was not just a ritual, it was theology in action. The preservation of the body was central to the belief in an afterlife. Organs were carefully removed and placed in canopic jars. The body was dehydrated with natron salts, wrapped layer by layer in linen, sealed in tombs with amulets, scrolls, and offerings. These weren't just dead bodies, they were portals to eternity, and for a time they stayed hidden, entombed beneath sand and stone, safe in chambers cut into rock, protected by curses carved into walls. But the sands shift, and eventually, strangers came. The first real appetite for Egyptian mummies outside Egypt wasn't spiritual, it was medicinal. By the late Middle Ages, European medical practitioners believed that the best remedies came from the body itself. This wasn't new. In fact, the concept, called corpse medicine, had been brewing for centuries. People drank blood to treat epilepsy. They ground up skull fragments for headaches. Human fat was rubbed on wounds. And the most prized remedy of all, mumia. Originally, mumia referred to a resinous, tar-like substance found in Persian mummies or in natural bitumen deposits. It was dark, sticky, and believed to have preservative powers. When early European apothecaries got hold of this material, they assumed, incorrectly, that the preserving force was the human body itself, that somehow the dead retained curative energy, that the flesh was the medicine. And so, a strange industry was born. Real mummies, actual Egyptian corpses, were shipped to Europe by the thousands, ground into powder, labelled as mumia, sold in pharmacies alongside leeches and lavender. It was taken for everything from headaches to internal bleeding, mixed into wine, dissolved in oil, packed into pills. And it wasn't just quacks and peasants. This was endorsed by physicians, by kings, by popes. The logic. If the body could survive for 2,000 years, then surely it contained powerful life force, a force that, if consumed, might stave off death. By the 16th century, the mummy trade was booming. Arab traders, European merchants, and even Egyptian locals found profit in the dead. Tombs that had survived for millennia were now wide open to looters, not just for gold or amulets, but for the bodies themselves. Desiccated remains, once wrapped with care and ritual, were unwrapped, sorted, and shipped like spice. Cairo's markets, once full of dates and grain, began to feature a different kind of export: powdered flesh. Apothecaries across Europe labelled jars simply as mumia, often with no clarity on the source. Was it resin? Was it bone? Was it meat? No one could say for sure, and no one really asked. Demand outpaced supply. Some sellers turned to fraud, grinding up recently deceased bodies and baking them in ovens to mimic the appearance of ancient mummified remains. They added tar, herbs and spices to reproduce the smell. A black market industry emerged where mummies were counterfeited like currency, and buyers, desperate for the healing power of the ancient dead, rarely noticed. Royalty, meanwhile, were hooked. King Francis I of France carried powdered mummy with him everywhere. He believed it could prevent death. In times of illness, he mixed it with wine. He wasn't alone. The practice spanned courts in England, Germany, Italy, and Spain. Physicians, despite growing skepticism from a handful of critics, continued to recommend it, not just for pain or illness, but for aging. The older the mummy, the greater its perceived strength. Egypt, once the land of the eternal dead, had become a graveyard stripped for parts. There was no dignity in the excavation, no reverence. Bodies were tossed into crates, skulls separated from torsos, bones cracked for marrow, linen burned for fuel, centuries of history reduced to dust. And yet, this wasn't seen as grotesque. It was science. It was progress. By the standards of the time, mummy medicine fit into a broader philosophy of sympathetic healing, the idea that like cures like. The dried flesh of the long dead might help with putrefaction in the body. Powdered bones might support skeletal injuries. Even human blood, taken fresh, was thought to carry the essence of life, and was sometimes administered by executioners to epileptics standing beneath gallows. The body was no longer sacred, it was medicinal, and while Egypt paid the price, Europe reaped the profits. Artists joined the frenzy, though in a different way. During the 18th and 19th centuries, some painters began using a pigment known as mummy brown, a rich, earthy colour derived quite literally from ground-up human remains. The pigment was praised for its transparency, its warmth, and its blendability. It was used in oil paints, watercolours, even varnishes. Painters like Eugène Delacroix and the Pre-Raphaelites incorporated mummy brown into their palettes, unknowingly mixing the dead into their art. Only later did some discover the truth and recoil. One story tells of a painter who, upon learning the source of his pigment, buried the remainder of his paint in the garden. Too late, though. The dead had already been immortalized on canvas. Meanwhile, travelers and tourists developed their own morbid fascination with mummies. In Victorian England, it became fashionable to attend unwrapping parties, where imported Egyptian mummies were displayed in parlours and unwrapped for entertainment. Guests would sip tea, nibble biscuits, and watch as layers of linen were peeled away to reveal leathery skin, ancient jewellery, and the contorted rictus of the long dead. These weren't medical procedures, they were spectacles, a chance to play archaeologist, to poke at history, to own a piece of the past, all under the banner of curiosity. The justifications were elaborate. European physicians and scholars didn't see themselves as desecrating the dead. They saw themselves as participating in a grand medical lineage. The ancient Greeks had laid the philosophical groundwork. Hippocrates spoke of humours. Galen categorized the properties of organs. When Arabic and Persian medical texts arrived in Europe during the Middle Ages, they were absorbed into this evolving body of knowledge, and some of those texts referenced mumia. but context was lost in translation. What had once referred to natural bitumen, used externally in Islamic medicine, was now interpreted as mummy, the preserved body itself. And not just any body, an Egyptian one. The older, the better. The logic twisted itself into knots. If the ancient Egyptians had unlocked secrets of preservation, then their bodies must contain those secrets. Eating them became not just acceptable, but logical. A way of inheriting ancient wisdom through osmosis or digestion. This fusion of mysticism and medicine wasn't rare. Renaissance Europe was fascinated by alchemy, astrology, and natural magic. The line between science and superstition was blurry. People believed in transmutation, in the philosopher's stone, in elixirs of eternal life. The corpse, in this worldview, wasn't just a relic, it was a tool, a material full of essence and energy. And nowhere was this more evident than in the practice of medicinal cannibalism. Blood was fresh life, fat held warmth and strength, bones stored memory. Mummies. Mummies were like concentrated magic, 2,000-year-old medicine wrapped in sacred cloth. This belief wasn't confined to dusty apothecaries. It reached the highest echelons of power. In 1679, the German physician Johann Schröder published Pharmacopoeia Medico-Chimica, a widely used reference guide. Among its prescriptions, pulverized human skull for epilepsy and fresh human blood, still warm from the body, for vitality. Executioners became unwitting participants in medicine. They were often asked to sell blood and fat from the bodies they dispatched. Public executions became dual-purpose events, justice for some, healing for others. Mummies, however, were the crown jewel. They were exotic, ancient, foreign, and crucially, they were not European. This made their consumption easier to stomach, both literally and morally. There was a strange comfort in the distance. The Egyptian dead were so far removed from contemporary life that people could convince themselves it wasn't cannibalism. It was something else, a foreign medicine, a mystical substance, a curiosity. Even so, dissenting voices emerged. Some physicians began to question the efficacy and the ethics of eating the dead. Concerns about authenticity surfaced. Was this really ancient flesh, or just baked peasants sold as Persian medicine? More importantly, did it work? The answer was murky. Some patients swore by it, others found no benefit, and a few grew violently ill. Contamination was common, preservation was poor. Rotting corpses don't always cooperate with miracle cures, but demand held strong for centuries. And Egypt kept bleeding. Tombs were emptied, sarcophagi smashed, hieroglyphs scraped off. Bodies snapped in half to fit into crates. Entire cemeteries stripped like forests for lumber. Some mummies were even burned as train fuel, cheaper than wood. Egyptologists would later describe the 17th and 18th centuries as a dark age for antiquities, not because the past was forgotten, but because it was devoured. By the 18th century, a strange duality had formed around the mummy. It was both a sacred relic and a novelty item, revered and ridiculed, marketed to the elite as medicine, while simultaneously auctioned to the curious as decor. In the parlours of London, Vienna, and Paris, mummies had become conversation pieces. Literally. Wealthy collectors would display them in drawing rooms, their linen wraps partially removed to show bone, skin, and artifacts. Dinner guests sipped sherry and speculated aloud about the life the body might have once lived. Some even claimed they could feel the ancient energy emanating from the corpse, as though death itself might offer spiritual clarity if you stood close enough. It was spectacle disguised as scholarship. But not everyone was content to simply look at mummies. The trend of mummy unwrapping parties surged during the Victorian era. At these events, which blurred the lines between scientific demonstration and grotesque entertainment, a host, usually a gentleman with a collection or ties to Egyptology, would procure a wrapped mummy, often from a dubious source. He'd gather an audience in his home or in a rented hall. Then, like a magician pulling cloth from a box, he would carefully begin to unravel the linen. Layer by layer, the room would fall into an eerie silence as the ancient body was revealed. The skin, darkened by resin and time, might be leathery, brittle, or decayed. Jewelry occasionally fell from folds. Beetles and bits of amulets clattered to the floor, the stench of preservation chemicals mixed with the dry rot of time. Guests would gag, gasp, and marvel. Some took notes. Others collected bits of linen as souvenirs. These parties were not rare. They were cultural phenomena, bridging the gap between science and socializing, cloaked in a colonial mindset that saw Egypt not as a sovereign civilization, but as a warehouse of artifacts to be plundered, studied, and consumed. And beneath the public intrigue, the medical market still thrived. By now, the trade had formalized. Entire supply chains were established. Egyptian tomb raiders worked under the eye of European agents. Bodies were appraised, categorized, and exported like goods. The most intact mummies fetched the highest prices, particularly if they still bore inscriptions or showed signs of royalty. Forgeries abounded. Some entrepreneurs baked local corpses, criminals, the poor, plague victims, in low heat and covered them in resin to replicate the ancient look. These faux mummies were then sold to European collectors and pharmacies as authentic. With no regulatory oversight, the line between Egyptian nobility and recently deceased beggars grew thin, and still, the belief persisted. Even as Enlightenment ideals spread across Europe, even as rationalism and empirical science took hold, mummy medicine retained its foothold. It evolved. It adapted. Doctors now blended mummy powder into increasingly complex concoctions. It was often paired with herbs like myrrh and saffron, mixed with opiates, or added to early forms of alcohol-based tinctures. Apothecaries stocked it not just for its supposed healing properties, but because it sold. People wanted it. That's what kept the market alive. Demand. Because behind all the rituals, all the academic justifications, all the Victorian curiosity, was something deeply human, the fear of death. If even the smallest chance existed that consuming part of a 2,000-year-old body might preserve your own, wasn't it worth trying? And if society allowed it, if the church didn't stop you, if doctors recommended it, if kings endorsed it, then why not? It's easy now to look back and recoil, to see it as barbaric, grotesque. But to those living through the 18th and early 19th centuries, mummy consumption was just one thread in a vast, tangled web of beliefs about mortality, health, and the body. This was an era that believed in phrenology, the idea that skull shapes could reveal character, that women's uteruses could wander through the body, that bloodletting cured fever, that mercury could treat syphilis, that electric shock therapy could reverse madness. In that context, powdered mummy didn't seem strange. It seemed sophisticated, progressive even. And it wasn't just medical professionals who clung to the practice. Religious figures were split. Some condemned it as cannibalism. These jokes masked a deeper reckoning. because the West was beginning to realize what it had done. Tomb by tomb, crypt by crypt, it had harvested the ancient dead for profit and pleasure. It had ground up history, burned heritage as fuel, displayed people's ancestors in glass boxes for afternoon amusement. The cognitive dissonance was hard to ignore. Museums, now emerging as formal institutions, started to adopt new rules. Some banned the purchase of mummies outright. Others created ethical guidelines for display. The idea that the dead deserved rest, not reverence, not ridicule, not research, began to take hold. Slowly, mummy unwrapping parties declined. Slowly, sales dropped. But supply still existed, and it needed a new outlet. Despite the growing backlash and shifting ethical standards, mummy exploitation persisted deep into the modern era, not just in museums or films, but in the odd corners of commerce, tourism, and medical folklore that refused to let go. By the late 19th century, a strange black market had emerged. As mummy unwrapping parties declined in popularity and laws surrounding artifact export tightened, demand shifted underground. Tomb raiders, known colloquially as antiquities hunters, continued to plunder remote sites across Egypt. Working under the cover of darkness and with minimal tools, they chiseled into ancient tombs, yanked coffins from crypts, and dragged mummies out by the dozen. Many of these bodies weren't destined for museum halls or academic study. They were meant to be resold to tourists, to private collectors, even bizarrely to paper mills. That's right. In the 19th century, American entrepreneurs discovered that mummies, specifically the linen wrappings, could be processed into paper. It wasn't high-quality parchment, but it was cheap and abundant. Reports emerged of paper manufacturers in the northeastern US importing mummies by the shipload, shredding them on arrival, and churning out newspapers and wrapping paper. This practice was short-lived, largely due to public revulsion once the truth got out. But the fact that it existed at all is a brutal reminder of just how disposable ancient bodies had become in the eyes of Western industry. At the same time, Egypt itself was being repackaged as a destination. With the expansion of European railroads and the introduction of steamship lines along the Nile, upper-class tourists from Britain, France, and Germany began embarking on what came to be known as the Grand Tour of Egypt. These trips, promoted by travel agencies like Thomas Cook and Son, offered affluent Westerners a carefully curated taste of ancient wonder, camel rides, pyramid visits, and, inevitably, a brush with the dead. Vendors near archaeological sites sold authentic mummy parts, teeth, fingers, amulets still wrapped in linen. Most of these were fakes, cobbled together from local remains or outright fabricated, but some were very real, fragments chipped from desecrated tombs and sold by the handful. There was almost no regulation. Travelers returned home boasting of their souvenirs, small bits of history stashed in pockets and trunks. One British socialite famously gifted her dinner guests slivers of a mummy's rib, framed and labelled. The gesture was received with laughter and fascination, not horror. It was a time when ownership of the past conferred power. To display a piece of Egypt in your parlour was to declare yourself worldly, educated, perhaps even noble. And yet, beneath all this glamour, whispers of guilt persisted. The mummy was beginning to haunt the Western conscience, not in the literal cinematic sense, but as a symbol, a reminder, a reckoning. Writers once again led the charge. In 1903, H. Rider Haggard published Smith and the Pharaohs, a short story in which a British museum goer is confronted by the spirit of the mummy he's stolen. The tale is satirical but pointed, questioning the morality of archaeological looting. Around the same time, poets began to describe mummies as silent witnesses and strangers torn from their sleep. No longer monsters, no longer commodities, but victims. In academia, the tone was shifting too. Anthropologists such as Franz Boas began emphasizing cultural relativism, the idea that civilizations should be understood on their own terms, not through the lens of colonial superiority. Under this philosophy, the desecration of mummies wasn't just unethical, it was deeply disrespectful, a violation of the very concept of human dignity. Meanwhile, Egyptian scholars and officials became increasingly vocal. Figures like Ahmed Kamal, often referred to as the first Egyptian Egyptologist, began to reclaim their heritage. Kamal and others challenged the narrative that Egypt's history belonged to the West. They pushed for laws to protect tombs, restrict exports, and return artifacts. But the tide was hard to turn. Western museums remained reluctant to relinquish their collections. Some argued that the artifacts were safer in Europe. Others claimed that since they had been acquired legally, by the standards of the time, they had no obligation to return them. This debate continues to this day, but change was happening, slowly. One of the most pivotal moments came in 1924, when the Egyptian government passed a law banning the export of antiquities. Though difficult to enforce, the law marked a shift in policy and power. Egypt was no longer content to be mined for its past. And as Egypt asserted itself, so too did the modern idea of repatriation. Across the 20th and early 21st centuries, governments, activists, and scholars have campaigned to return mummies and artifacts to their countries of origin. Some museums have complied, others have resisted, but the movement is growing, powered by both ethical concerns and a broader reckoning with colonialism. Still, the question lingers. What does it mean to own history? And who gets to tell it? Because while the act of physically eating mummies may be behind us, the impulse that drove it, the desire to possess, to consume, to benefit from the ancient world, remains alive in different forms. Tourism, academia, media. Even now, countless films, games, and books capitalize on Egypt's past. Mummies remain staples of Halloween decor, cartoon villains, pop culture shorthand for the exotic and the eerie. In many ways, we've just swapped one kind of consumption for another, but there are signs of progress. Modern exhibitions are increasingly curated in partnership with Egyptian scholars. Human remains are treated with greater care. Some museums have removed mummies from public display entirely, citing respect for the dead. And more importantly, the stories being told are changing. No longer is the mummy just a curiosity or a monster. It is a person, a soul, a voice from the past asking to be heard, not mined, not mocked, and certainly not consumed. The story of mummy consumption is bizarre enough on its own, but what truly cements it as one of the most haunting chapters in Western history is how little most people know about it. The idea that people, well-off, educated, even noble, were consuming human remains just centuries ago is not taught in schools. It isn't a cultural touchstone. There are no public apologies, no museums dedicated to the practice, no major documentaries highlighting its scale. Instead, it sits at the edge of collective memory, too strange to believe, too uncomfortable to face. And yet, it's real. It happened, and its echoes remain, not just in museums or dusty tomes, but but in our attitudes toward ancient history, medicine, and even the commodification of the dead. Let's step back again to understand how this all came to be. The practice of body-based medicine was not limited to mummies. In fact, European apothecaries in the Middle Ages and Renaissance dealt in a wide array of human ingredients: blood, fat, bones, urine, hair. The so-called king's drops were made from powdered skull, steeped in alcohol, and taken as a treatment for epilepsy and head injuries. Executioners were sometimes paid extra to deliver fresh bodies to medical practitioners. The closer a person had died to the moment of harvesting, the more potent their remains were believed to be. It was a brutal economy, and it was rooted not just in desperation or ignorance, but in belief. The belief that life essence could be transferred through physical remains. That power, health, or knowledge could be absorbed from another being's tissue. This was sympathetic magic, a concept that predates written history. You are what you eat, the saying goes. In Europe, this turned into something grotesque. And so, when Egyptian mummies began appearing in greater numbers through trade and conquest, they were simply absorbed into an existing framework. Their age made them alluring. Their foreignness made them mysterious. And their preservation made them ideal candidates for a society already primed to ingest human materials. By the time powdered mummy became a staple in apothecaries, it was almost mundane. It had joined the ranks of other remedies: wolf livers, bear bile, powdered pearls. Just another item on a shelf. What made it so different, though, was scale. Egypt had been embalming its dead for over 3,000 years. By some estimates, more than 70 million people were mummified in ancient Egypt. This meant there was, quite literally, an enormous supply. For centuries, European traders capitalized on this. They arranged deals with locals, bribed guards, or looted sites outright. Some even hired workers to produce fake mummies using the bodies of criminals or the indigent, soaked in bitumen and dried to mimic the texture and appearance of true ancient remains. Authenticity wasn't always a priority. Profit was. And at its peak, the mummy trade was booming. Shipments would arrive at European ports, crates filled with desiccated corpses, or boxes of pre-ground powder merchants advertised their wares with flowery language. Genuine Theban dust, Ipharionic tonic, sacred resin of the Nile. Apothecaries bought in bulk. Artists bought in bulk. Even fabric makers bought in bulk, seeking the linen wrappings for their texture or dye. The Egyptian dead became an industry, and that industry extended beyond the material to the myth. Because to justify the consumption of another culture's dead, you need a narrative, a framework, a story that transforms desecration into destiny. Europeans frame themselves as inheritors of the classical world. Egypt, in this telling, wasn't a modern country with living people. It was an open-air museum of the past. Its treasures were abandoned. Its artifacts were waiting to be discovered. Its tombs were not sacred, but forgotten. This mindset helped sanitize the act of removal, or consumption, or display. It allowed aristocrats to sip powdered flesh without guilt, allowed scientists to poke at wrapped fingers with silver tools, allowed painters to crush ribs into paint, and tourists to pocket teeth like candy. But not everyone agreed. Even during the height of the mummy craze, there were dissenting voices. Some religious leaders denounced the practice as sacrilegious. Some physicians warned that the powders were impure, contaminated, or ineffective. Some travelers recoiled at the sight of unwrapped corpses on banquet tables, describing the experience as grotesque. One French visitor to Egypt in the 1700s described watching a mummy unwrapping and feeling a sickness in the soul as linen peeled back and dried skin crumbled under candlelight. That sentiment grew stronger as the Enlightenment matured. Rationalism began to clash with romanticism. Science pushed against superstition. Medicine evolved. And by the time the 19th century drew to a close, the era of eating mummies had, largely, come to an end. But the legacy, it lingered, because even if people were no longer ingesting the dead, the idea of consuming history, of extracting utility from ancient lives, never fully went away. In fact, in some ways, it became more abstract, more sanitized, more corporate. By the early 20th century, the practice of eating mummies had vanished almost entirely, but the fascination with the dead, and particularly Egypt's dead, had only evolved. While powdered mummy no longer lined the shelves of apothecaries, mummies still served a purpose. They became objects of scientific dissection, forensic scrutiny, and public spectacle. New technologies gave rise to new kinds of exploitation. X-rays, for instance, were introduced into mummy research as early as the 1890s. Researchers used the new tech to peer inside ancient wrappings without disturbing the linen. It marked a pivotal shift, one that suggested we could study the dead with more care. But that didn't necessarily mean more respect. In fact, mummies were soon shipped to hospitals, universities, and radiological labs, scanned, cut open, and displayed again, only this time in clinical settings. Scholars justified the invasions as contributions to science, and while they did uncover details about ancient diseases, diets, and embalming practices, the underlying posture remained disturbingly familiar. These bodies were still being mined for value, still being used. Meanwhile, the public's appetite for mummies grew more theatrical. Traveling exhibitions toured across Europe and North America, sometimes bundled under titles like Secrets of the Pharaohs or Mysteries of the Tomb. Visitors paid admission to walk past glass cases and read placards about hieroglyphs, embalming rituals, and curses. These exhibits rarely focused on the individuals inside the wrappings, their lives, families, or humanity. Instead, they emphasized aesthetic mystery and spectacle. In many ways, the cultural framework had shifted only slightly, from consumption to observation, from ingestion to voyeurism, and all of it, still, at the expense of the dead. But something else was changing too, something slower, but perhaps more powerful. As colonial empires fell and post-colonial nations began to reclaim their narratives, a long overdue reckoning took shape. Egypt began to demand not just the return of artifacts, but the restoration of dignity. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo, for example, shifted its tone dramatically in the late 20th century. No longer just a collection of objects, it became a space for education and reverence. Mummies were given names when known. Their familial ties were researched. Some were taken off display and reburied with ceremony. Scholars began referring to them not as specimens, but as people. The shift was subtle, but profound. The West responded in waves. Some museums clung to their mummies, citing legal ownership. Others entered into long-term loans or returned select remains outright. Institutions like the Manchester Museum in the UK and the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., began to create ethical guidelines for human remains. Not everyone agreed. The debate remains tense, but the arc has begun to bend, slowly, steadily, toward restoration. Today, we remember the era of mummy consumption as a curiosity, a footnote, a historical oddity. But it is far more than that. It's a mirror. It reflects how we see the past, how we treat the dead, how we justify our appetites, whether for healing, for power, or for knowledge. And most uncomfortably, it reveals just how easily we can dehumanize those who came before us in the name of progress. We ate the dead. We powdered their bones and sold them by the gram. We told stories of curses while ignoring the real tragedy, that for centuries, the remains of men and women, once honored with sacred rites and intricate burials, were turned into medicine, paint, paper, and entertainment. And we rarely stop to ask what they might have thought of it all. So how should we remember this? How do we look back on an age when powdered royalty was sold behind pharmacy counters, when physicians treated ailments with dust scraped from ancient coffins, and when artists painted sunsets with pigment made from human remains? With disbelief? With shame? With curiosity? Maybe with all of it. Because the story of mummy consumption isn't just about medicine or trade or travel. It's about something deeply human. The relentless desire to hold on to life, even if it means taking it from the dead. We believed, in earnest, that consuming a preserved body could preserve our own, that someone else's life force, trapped in resin, wrapped in linen, embalmed in time, could be transferred into us, that swallowing history would help us escape our own mortality. Of course, it never did, but the myth was powerful. It still is. And in its most modern forms, that myth survives, not in powders or pigments, but in our thirst for youth, longevity, and permanence. We chase biohacking trends, freeze our DNA, upload our memories, and stretch the limits of what it means to live. Always forward, always longer, always afraid to stop. Perhaps the mummy, silent, stolen and sold, wasn't a cure, but a warning. Not a relic of backward thinking, but a reflection of our own obsession with permanence. A mirror to our fear of death and the extraordinary lengths we'll go to avoid it. So tonight, as you drift off, think about the hands that wrapped those linen strips thousands of years ago, the priests chanting hymns, the families saying goodbye, the kings entombed with treasures and hopes. And think too of the winding roads that carried their remains across continents, across centuries, into the mouths and museums of the modern world. History is not always noble, it is not always kind. But if we listen, quietly, patiently, it can still teach us, even now, even here, even in the dark.